An empire's collapse can forge a world more than its peak ever did. The fall of Rome shattered a superpower, leaving a vacuum of authority that reshaped civilization for 1,000 years. This was not merely an ending, but a dramatic rebirth that forged the medieval era. Ancient knowledge scattered, centralized power dissolved, and humanity was forced to rebuild everything from the ground up. You will understand exactly how the collapse of this ancient giant directly created the world of knights and castles, sparked the rise of legendary empires like the Franks and Byzantines, and completely rewired the structure of society itself. How did a boy emperor's quiet deposition unleash waves of chaos and creativity that defined an age? What does the desperate scramble for a fallen crown tell us about power itself? By the end of this story, you will see the hidden blueprint of our modern world, a legacy written in the ashes of Rome. What does it truly take for a civilization to be reborn? The empire in its final century was like a great tree, outwardly mighty but hollowed from within. Its vast bureaucracy grew heavier, its legions more expensive, and its currency began to lose value with every passing year. The government responded by demanding more taxes from its citizens, a crushing burden that strained the very people it was meant to protect. At the top, a revolving door of rulers, many more focused on palace intrigue than the health of the state, created a deep instability. This internal decay made the entire structure dangerously brittle. Then came a fateful decision that would permanently reshape the ancient world. The empire was formally divided into two separate administrative halves, an eastern one based in the wealthy city of Constantinople, and a western one that would continue to look to Rome. This was meant to make governing easier, but in reality it created a deep and lasting schism. The two halves began to drift apart, with the East growing richer and more secure while the West grew increasingly exposed. This vulnerability did not go unnoticed. From the vast plains of Central Asia, a new force was on the move, the nomadic Huns. Their relentless westward push acted like a hammer, driving entire populations of Germanic peoples before them. Tribes like the Visigoths and Vandals, desperate for safety and new lands, found themselves pressed right up against the Roman frontiers. They were not always invaders seeking destruction. At first, they were often refugees pleading for entry. The Roman system, however, was too strained and too inflexible to manage this immense human pressure gracefully. The result was a perfect storm, a collision of internal weakness and external force that the Western Empire simply could not withstand. The stage was set for a single, decisive event that would echo for centuries. In the year 476, a young boy named Romulus Augustulus was quietly removed from power. There was no epic final battle at the gates of Rome, no dramatic last stand. Instead, the event that history would mark as the fall of the Western Roman Empire was a strangely quiet affair, more of a bureaucratic formality than a violent overthrow. The Germanic leader Odoacer simply took control, but he made a decision that spoke volumes. He did not crown himself a new emperor of the West. Instead, he bundled up the imperial robes and the crown, the very symbols of centuries of power, and sent them east to the emperor in Constantinople. With that single, symbolic act, he declared that the empire no longer needed two rulers, that one Roman emperor was enough. The position of Western emperor was formally abolished. This was the true end, not with a bang, but with a whisper. It revealed a profound truth that the physical empire in the West had become a hollow shell, its institutions so weakened that they could be brushed aside without a major fight. The power was gone, but the idea of Rome, the ghost of its authority, remained so potent that even its conqueror felt compelled to honor it. The stage was now set for a colossal question. If there was no longer an emperor in Rome who would hold the reins of power, into this vast and echoing vacuum, new forces were already beginning to stir. The silence after the imperial title was abolished was not peaceful. It was the tense quiet of a throne room left empty, with no central authority to command armies or collect taxes. The intricate systems that had bound Western Europe together for centuries simply stopped functioning. The Roman peace, the famous Pax Romana, was over. In its place came a raw and urgent scramble, as every local warlord and migrating chieftain saw an opportunity to seize a piece of the former empire for themselves. This was not a coordinated invasion, but a chaotic, piecemeal process of settlement and conflict. The old Roman provinces, once unified under a single law, were suddenly a fractured map of ambition. In Spain, the Visigoths solidified their kingdom. Across North Africa, the Vandals controlled the vital grain supply. The Ostrogoths would soon establish a powerful realm in Italy itself, while in the province of Gaul, a people known as the Franks began their own remarkable ascent. These new kingdoms were often unstable, their borders constantly shifting through warfare and fragile alliances. The very idea of a unified Western Europe had vanished, replaced by a patchwork of competing powers, each trying to build something new upon the ancient Roman foundations. This fragmentation created a world where local strongholds and personal loyalty mattered more than distant, abstract citizenship. It was from this turbulent landscape that the first true medieval powers would slowly and painfully emerge. While the West dissolved into fractured kingdoms, the imperial throne in the East was not merely surviving, it was flourishing. Across the sea, in the magnificent city of Constantinople, the Roman Empire lived on, defiant and vibrant, for nearly another 1,000 years. We know this enduring state as the Byzantine Empire, but its people never used that term. They called themselves Romans, and with every right, for their empire was the direct, unbroken continuation of the Roman state. Constantinople itself was a marvel, a fortress city straddling Europe and Asia, its massive land walls deemed impregnable. Within those walls thrived a society that saw itself as the guardian of a sacred legacy. It was a unique fusion of Roman law, Greek language, and deep Christian faith, all administered by a sophisticated and intricate bureaucracy that kept the imperial machinery running with an efficiency the West could only dream of. This was not a remnant, it was a beacon, a center of global trade where silks and spices changed hands and ancient manuscripts were preserved and studied while libraries in Europe crumbled into dust. The Byzantines looked west at the new Germanic kingdoms and saw not sovereign states, but lost provinces, territories that rightfully belonged to their empire. This burning desire to restore Rome to its former glory found its ultimate expression in the ambitions of one emperor, Justinian. He was determined to be the one who would stitch the old empire back together. Launching a series of massive military campaigns, his brilliant generals, Belisarius and Narses, managed to reconquer North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and even parts of Spain. For a brief, stunning moment, it seemed as if the Mediterranean might once again become a Roman lake. But these victories came at a terrible cost, draining the imperial treasury and leaving the reclaimed lands exhausted and vulnerable. Justinian's grand project ultimately proved impossible to sustain, yet it sent a powerful message to the emerging medieval world. The ghost of Rome was not just a memory, it was a real and active power, a constant reminder of a lost unity that would inspire kings and emperors for centuries to come. How would this living relic of ancient power interact with the rough new kingdoms taking root in the West? Out of that fractured landscape of competing tribes, one power began to consolidate with startling speed. The Franks were a collection of Germanic peoples who had settled in the old Roman province of Gaul, and for a time, they were just one of many warring factions. Their transformation into the dominant force of Western Europe began with a single, ruthless, and brilliant king, Clovis. He started his rule as little more than a minor chieftain, but through a combination of shrewd diplomacy and relentless warfare, he systematically united all the Frankish tribes under his sole command. His expansion did not stop there. He turned his armies against the last Roman governor in Gaul, against the Visigoths in the south, and against neighboring Germanic kingdoms, carving out a realm that stretched from the Rhine deep into what is now France. But his most consequential move was not on the battlefield. It was a spiritual and political calculation that would reshape European history for 1,000 years. While many other Germanic rulers adhered to a form of Christianity known as Arianism, which was viewed as unorthodox by the mainstream church, Clovis made a fateful decision. He converted to Catholic Christianity. The story goes that during a desperate battle, he cried out to the god of his Christian wife, Clotilda, and pledged to convert if he was granted victory. When the tide of the battle turned in his favor, he followed through. This was not merely a personal religious awakening, it was a masterstroke of statecraft. By embracing the faith of the vast majority of the Gallo-Roman population he now ruled, Clovis instantly transformed himself from a foreign conqueror into a legitimate king in their eyes. The powerful network of Catholic bishops, who were often the last remnants of Roman administrative order in their cities, threw their crucial support behind him. This alliance between the Frankish crown and the Catholic Church provided his new kingdom with a foundation of stability, legitimacy, and bureaucratic skill that his rivals simply could not match. The dynasty he founded, the Merovingians, became the most powerful and enduring kingdom in the post-Roman West, a direct result of this fusion. It proved that the future lay not in pure conquest, but in a powerful new blend of Germanic warrior culture, Roman administrative tradition, and universal Christian faith. This potent recipe for power would not be forgotten by the kings who followed. Yet the powerful kingdom Clovis built would not remain in his direct line forever. Over the generations, the Merovingian kings slowly began to fade from the center of power, becoming what later chroniclers would dismissively call the do-nothing kings. They reigned, but they did not rule. The true engine of the Frankish state was a different office entirely, that of the mayor of the palace. Think of this role as the ultimate chief of staff, the man who managed the treasury, commanded the armies, and made the day-to-day decisions that kept the kingdom running. While the king wore the crown, the mayor held the real power, and no family mastered this position better than the descendants of a man named Pepin of Herstal. His son, Charles Martel, would not just manage the kingdom, he would save it. A massive Islamic army, part of the expanding Umayyad Caliphate, had crossed from Spain into Frankish territory, raiding deep into the heart of Gaul. Charles Martel rallied the Frankish forces and met them near the city of Tours. The battle was a brutal, day-long struggle, but the Frankish infantry held their ground against repeated cavalry charges. The Umayyad commander fell, and his army withdrew back to Spain. In that single afternoon, Charles Martel was hailed as the savior of Christendom. He had not only stopped the advance, he had cemented his family's reputation as the true defenders of the West. His son, Pepin the Short, faced a different kind of problem. He already had the power of his father, but he lacked the title of king. He needed legitimacy, a way to make his rule official in the eyes of the people and the nobility. So he sent a question to the Pope in Rome. Who should be the true king, the man who holds the power, or the man who only holds the name? The Pope, who himself needed a powerful military ally to protect him from hostile forces in Italy, gave the only answer that made sense. He declared that Pepin should be king. In a sacred ceremony, the last Merovingian king was tonsured, his long hair shorn, the symbol of his royal birth removed, and sent to live out his days in a monastery. Pepin the Short was then anointed as the new king of the Franks, founding the Carolingian dynasty. This was a revolution blessed by heaven itself. For the first time, the spiritual authority of the Pope in Rome had been used to create a secular king in the West. This partnership between the Frankish crown and the papacy forged an unbreakable bond, a fusion of political and religious power that would soon reach its breathtaking climax. On Christmas Day in the year 800, the ancient Basilica of St. Peter in Rome was packed with worshippers. The air was thick with incense and the murmur of prayer. Suddenly, as the mighty king of the Franks, Charlemagne, knelt in devotion before the altar, Pope Leo III stepped forward. In his hands was a glittering crown. Before anyone could fully grasp the moment, the Pope placed it upon the kneeling king's head. The assembled crowd, carefully prepared for this instant, erupted in a thunderous chant. They hailed him as Carolo Augusto, Charles Augustus, Emperor of the Romans. This was not a simple coronation. It was an act of world-changing theater. In one breathtaking gesture, a Germanic warrior king was transformed into the direct successor of the Caesars. The Pope, by his own spiritual authority, had resurrected the imperial title that had lain dormant in the West for over 300 years. The symbolism was profound and deliberate. It declared that the political vacuum left by Rome's fall was now officially filled. A new Roman Empire was being born, not from the old Senate and people of Rome, but from a sacred partnership between the Church and the most powerful ruler in the West. Charlemagne's vast domain, which stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube and from the North Sea to central Italy, was now christened as a unified Christian empire. This new entity was called Christendom, a single civilization where political loyalty and religious faith were fused into one inseparable whole. The emperor was the sword and shield of the Church, and the Pope was the spiritual anchor of the emperor. This model of power, a king anointed by God through his Church, became the ultimate political ideal for the entire medieval period. It ended the long era of fragmentation by providing a new, compelling vision of unity. How would this reborn empire, forged in a cathedral on a Christmas morning, actually function? Could one man's power truly hold such a vast and varied territory together? That crown was far more than a symbol of raw political power. Charlemagne understood that a true empire needed a mind as well as a sword. His court at Aachen became a magnetic center for the greatest intellects he could find, drawing scholars from Italy, Spain, England, and Ireland into a grand project of revival. The most famous of these was a brilliant teacher from York named Alcuin, who became the emperor's chief advisor on matters of education and culture. This was the dawn of the Carolingian Renaissance, a conscious and deliberate effort to recapture the lost light of Roman learning and fuse it with the Christian faith and the practical needs of his Germanic kingdom. Imagine the challenge. Classical knowledge was scattered, locked away in isolated monasteries where manuscripts were slowly decaying, copied in regional scripts that were often difficult to read. There was no standard way to write Latin, the language of the church and administration. Charlemagne and his scholars set out to fix this, launching one of the most ambitious cultural rescue missions in history. They established schools not just for the clergy but for the sons of nobles, aiming to create a new class of literate administrators to run his vast empire. They meticulously collected and copied ancient Roman texts, from the works of Virgil to the philosophies of Cicero, saving countless manuscripts from being lost forever. And in a stroke of genius that would shape writing for centuries, they developed a new, clear, and legible script known as the Carolingian minuscule. With its distinct lowercase letters and spaces between words, it revolutionized reading, making it faster and easier. This was the birth of the handwriting that would later evolve into the standard typefaces of the printed book. This intellectual revival was not about mere nostalgia. It was about building the tools for governance. A standardized Latin meant that a law written in Ochen could be understood in the farthest reaches of the realm. An educated clergy could properly administer the sacraments and guide the people. By preserving Roman law and blending it with Frankish custom, Charlemagne was constructing a legal and bureaucratic framework to hold his empire together. The Carolingian Renaissance proved that a reborn empire could also spark a rebirth of the mind, laying the essential groundwork for the entire medieval scholarly tradition. But could this brilliant fusion of power and learning survive the man who created it? But the grand empire Charlemagne built was a magnificent sandcastle, destined to be washed away by the relentless tide of tradition. Frankish custom demanded that a father's lands be divided equally among his surviving sons, a practice that treated the realm not as an indivisible state, but as a personal inheritance to be parceled out. This single, unyielding tradition would prove to be the empire's fatal flaw. Charlemagne himself had been the sole survivor of a division, but his own son, Louis the Pious, was not so fortunate. Upon his passing, the empire was torn apart by a bitter civil war between his three own grandsons, each brother fighting not for the integrity of the whole, but for his own piece of the puzzle. Their conflict was finally resolved in the year 843 with the Treaty of Verdun. This agreement carved the Carolingian Empire into three separate kingdoms. Charles the Bald took the western portion, a land that would evolve into the Kingdom of France. Louis the German received the eastern lands, the foundation of what would become Germany. And the eldest brother, Lothair, was given the imperial title and a long, narrow strip of territory running from the North Sea down to Italy, a kingdom that bore his name, Lotharingia. This middle kingdom was the empire's spine, and its division was a catastrophe. It contained the strategic Alps and the vital Rhone River Valley, but it had no natural, defensible borders. Lotharingia was doomed to become a permanent battleground, a bloody corridor fought over by its stronger western and eastern neighbors for centuries to come. The Treaty of Verdun was a political failure of the highest order. It demonstrated with brutal clarity that a vast, centralized state could not be maintained without the robust Roman institutions of professional administration, a standing army, and a concept of the state that transcended the ruling family. With that centralized power shattered, the world once again spiraled into a period of deep instability. New waves of invaders, Vikings from the north, Magyars from the east, and Saracens from the south, began to raid deep into the fractured heart of Europe. The kings, their power and resources divided, could no longer mount an effective defense. People could not look to a distant, impotent emperor for protection. In this crisis, they were forced to look elsewhere, to the local strongman, the powerful landowner, the knight who could offer safety in exchange for service. From this desperate need for local order, a new and intricate web of obligations began to form, a system of power that would come to define the medieval world for the next 500 years. From the northern mists came a new kind of terror, one perfectly designed to exploit the fractured Carolingian world. The Vikings did not fight for land in the traditional sense, at least not at first. Their strategy was built on speed and shock. Their iconic longships with shallow drafts that could sail up rivers and land on beaches far from the sea gave them the element of surprise. They would appear without warning, striking vulnerable, undefended targets with brutal efficiency. Their preferred targets were the rich monasteries and towns that dotted the coastline and riverways, places like Lindisfarne in England or St. Philibert in Francia, which were storehouses of gold, silver, and precious artifacts, yet had no military garrisons. These were not battles, they were lightning raids. The attackers would plunder, take captives for ransom or slavery, and vanish back to the sea before any royal army could even be mustered. The psychological impact was devastating. No coastal or river community felt safe. The old Roman roads that had once allowed legions to march swiftly to a crisis were now used by these sea wolves to penetrate deep into the heart of Europe, striking Paris itself. The fundamental promise of kingship, the provision of security and justice, was being broken daily. A king sitting in Aachen or Paris was simply too far away, his response too slow, his power too diluted by the divisions of Verdun. What use was a faraway emperor who could not stop the flames from consuming your home? In this atmosphere of pervasive fear, people had no choice but to turn inward, to seek protection from the strongest local power they could find. This was the great acceleration of a process we call feudalism. Local strongmen, counts, and dukes, who already controlled land and could summon their own bands of armed retainers, became the only viable source of safety. Peasants would pledge their labor and a portion of their crops to a local lord in exchange for his protection. Lesser knights would pledge their military service to a greater lord in return for land, known as a fief. This created a pyramid of personal loyalties, from the knight to the count to the duke, that often bypassed the king entirely. The lord's castle, initially a simple wooden fort on a hill, became the new center of power and security, a visible promise of defense that a distant king could not offer. This system was not entirely new, but the Viking onslaught poured fuel on its flames, making it the essential, non-negotiable structure of society. Even the Vikings themselves were eventually woven into this fabric. They were not just destroyers, they were also settlers. In England, their prolonged invasions led to the establishment of the Danelaw, a vast territory where Danish law and custom held sway. And in a move of profound irony, the Frankish king would grant a huge tract of land at the mouth of the Seine to a Viking chieftain named Rollo, creating the Duchy of Normandy. These Northmen would become the Normans, adopting the French language and the feudal system, and would go on to reshape the history of England and southern Italy. The Viking Age, which began as an external shock, ended by reinforcing the very decentralized world it had exploited, locking the local lord and his castle into the heart of the medieval political landscape for centuries to come. This decentralized reality forged a new pyramid of power, one built not on marble and imperial decrees, but on soil and personal oaths. The feudal system became the essential skeleton of medieval society, a direct response to the collapse of centralized authority. At its heart was a simple, powerful bargain, the exchange of land for loyalty and military service. Imagine a vast social ladder with the king at the very top. He was the ultimate landowner, but he could not possibly manage or defend all of his territory alone. So he would grant large parcels of this land, known as fiefs, to his most powerful and trusted followers, his great lords or barons. In return, these lords swore a sacred oath to provide the king with a certain number of fully equipped knights for a set number of days each year. This bond was sealed in a deeply symbolic public ceremony called homage and fealty. A lord would kneel before the king, place his hands between the king's own, and declare himself the king's man. He would then swear an oath of fealty, a promise of unwavering loyalty. This was more than a contract. It was a fusion of legal duty and profound personal honor, creating a chain of obligation that was meant to be unbreakable. But the pyramid did not stop there. A great lord, now holding a vast fief, faced the same problem as the king. He too needed knights to fulfill his own military commitment and to police his lands. So he would subdivide his own fief, granting smaller portions to his own trusted knights, who would in turn become his vassals, swearing the same oath of homage and fealty to him. A knight might pledge to serve his lord for 40 days of combat each year. This created a cascading chain of command, from the king to a duke, from the duke to a count, from the count to a simple knight, and from that knight down to the peasants who worked the land. The fief was not just a plot of earth, it was the very source of a warrior's livelihood. The income from its farms and villages paid for his horse, his armor, and his weapons, allowing him to dedicate his life to the profession of war. This entire structure provided what the absent empire and the weakened kings could not: localized security and a clear, functioning hierarchy. It was a world where a man's primary loyalty was to his immediate lord, the person who granted him land and protection, not to a distant, abstract nation. This intricate web of personal relationships became the new glue holding a fractured world together, a functional, if deeply unequal, alternative to the ghost of imperial Rome. This intricate web of loyalty and land required an equally robust economic engine to sustain it. That engine was the manor, a self-contained world that functioned as the basic economic unit of the medieval countryside. Picture not a single grand castle, but a vast farming estate centered on a village, its fields, pastures, and woodlands all owned by the local lord. This was the manorial system, the economic counterpart to the political structure of feudalism. While feudalism organized the relationships of the warrior class, manorialism organized the daily lives and labor of the vast majority of the population, the peasants who worked the land. At the heart of this system was a simple, brutal reality: the need for self-sufficiency. With long-distance trade collapsed and roads dangerous, each manor had to produce everything it needed to survive, from food and cloth to tools and housing. The entire community's fate was tied to the harvest. To manage this precarious existence, they developed an agricultural innovation of stunning practicality: the three-field system. Instead of farming all their land until it was exhausted, they divided their arable land into 3 large fields. One field would be planted with a winter crop like wheat or rye. A second would be planted with a spring crop like oats, barley, or legumes like peas and beans. The third field would be left fallow, resting unplanted for a full year to allow the soil to recover its nutrients. Each year, they would rotate these assignments. This brilliant cycle of rotation dramatically increased overall food production and reduced the risk of a total crop failure from blight or poor weather, providing a crucial buffer against famine. The land itself was divided in a way that reflected the social order. A significant portion, usually about a third, was the lord's demesne. This was the lord's own personal land, and all the food grown on it went directly to support his household, his knights, and his retainers. The rest of the land was divided into many long, narrow strips that were farmed by the peasant families. A typical family would not have one consolidated farm, but rather a collection of these strips scattered across the different fields, a method that ensured every family got a mix of good and bad soil. The people who worked this land were the serfs. They were not slaves who could be sold away from the land, but they were not free to leave either. They were legally bound to the manor, tied to the soil itself. In exchange for the right to farm their own strips for their family's survival, they owed the lord a heavy and unending list of obligations. They were required to spend several days each week laboring on the lord's demesne, doing the plowing, sowing, and harvesting that filled his granaries. They also had to give the lord a share of their own harvest from their strips. Beyond this, they paid various fees, like using the lord's mill to grind their grain or his oven to bake their bread. They even owed special payments for major life events, like when a son inherited his father's strips or when a daughter married someone from another manor. It was a life of relentless toil, but it was a life with a defined place and a measure of security. The lord, in turn, was obligated to provide protection from raiders and bandits and to administer justice in his manor court. This reciprocal, if deeply unequal, relationship created a stable, localized economic cell that could function independently in a world of fractured kingdoms and absent kings. The manor was the true bedrock of medieval power, the source of all wealth, and the foundation upon which the entire feudal pyramid ultimately rested. While the lord's castle offered physical protection, another institution was building a fortress for the soul. In the sprawling vacuum left by Rome, the Roman Catholic Church emerged not just as a spiritual guide, but as the single most stable and powerful organization in Western Europe. It began its journey as a persecuted sect hiding in catacombs, but after the empire's official adoption of Christianity, its structure began to mirror the very imperial bureaucracy that had once hunted it. It was this robust organization, with its network of bishops governing dioceses from urban centers, that allowed the church to survive the political collapse when everything else was falling apart. While kings fought and kingdoms fractured, the church remained, a constant presence in every village and town, offering a universal message of hope and order in a world descending into chaos. It became the sole institution that could claim authority from London to Jerusalem, providing the only common moral and legal framework across a divided continent. This unified spiritual realm, known as Christendom, bound every individual from the lowliest serf to the most powerful king under the ultimate spiritual leadership of the Pope in Rome. It was a revolutionary idea that all of Western Europe was one community, a single Christian civilization. This spiritual authority quickly translated into immense temporal power. The church was not just a collection of cathedrals, it was one of the largest landowners in Europe, its vast estates and monasteries generating enormous wealth that made it a major economic and political player. More crucially, it held a monopoly on something even more valuable: literacy and administration. In a world where few outside the clergy could read or write, the church became the indispensable keeper of records, the scribe for royal charters, and the trainer of the only men capable of managing a complex government. A king needed a churchman to run his treasury and draft his laws. This gave the church tremendous leverage. We have already seen how Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne, an act that demonstrated the papacy's power to create emperors. But this was not a one-time event. Popes regularly acted as international arbiters, negotiating peace treaties between warring kings and using the threat of excommunication, a spiritual death sentence that cut a ruler off from the sacraments and could absolve all his subjects of their loyalty to him. When a king was excommunicated, his authority could crumble overnight. By stepping into the vacuum left by Rome, the church became the central pillar of medieval society, a key player in the rebirth of empires and the quiet architect of the very idea of a unified Europe. That imperial crown, forged in the fires of Charlemagne's ambition, did not vanish with his fractured kingdom. Its potent idea simply drifted eastward, finding a new home and a new champion among the German tribes. In the year 962, another king knelt in Rome, and another pope placed a crown upon his head. This was Otto I, the powerful king of the Germans, and his coronation officially founded the entity that would become known as the Holy Roman Empire. It was a deliberate reenactment of Charlemagne's moment, a declaration that the Roman imperial title, now sanctified with the word holy, was the rightful inheritance of the German king. This new empire saw itself as the direct, unbroken successor to both Charlemagne and the ancient Caesars, a spiritual and political vessel for the dream of a unified Christendom. Its heartland, however, was not in France or Italy, but in the dense forests and river valleys of Germany, stretching north into the plains and south across the Alps into the wealthy cities of northern Italy. This was not a nation in the modern sense, but a vast confederation of duchies, bishoprics, and free cities, all bound by a shared allegiance to the emperor. For centuries, this institution kept the flickering flame of a unified Western Roman Empire alive, a ghost of Rome given political form. Yet this very ambition planted the seeds for an epic power struggle. The emperor and the pope, the two heads of Christendom, began a dangerous dance. Both claimed authority from God, but which one held the ultimate power on earth? The conflict came to a head over a seemingly simple question: who had the right to appoint a bishop? To modern eyes, this might seem like a purely religious matter. But in the medieval world, a bishop was not just a spiritual leader, he was a major political and economic power. He controlled vast church lands, commanded knights, and collected taxes. An emperor who could appoint his own loyal supporters as bishops could control a huge portion of his empire's wealth and military force, ensuring their loyalty to the crown. The popes saw this as a corrupting intrusion of secular power into the sacred sphere of the church, a practice they called lay investiture. The conflict, known as the investiture controversy, erupted into a war of wills that would define the 11th and 12th centuries. It pitted emperor against pope in a dramatic public drama of excommunications, rival councils, and even military standoffs. The most famous confrontation saw the German Emperor Henry IV standing barefoot in the snow for 3 days outside a castle at Canossa, begging Pope Gregory VII for forgiveness and absolution. This image of the most powerful ruler in Europe humbling himself before the church was a stunning propaganda victory for the papacy, yet the struggle was ultimately resolved by a compromise. The Concordat of Worms in the year 1122 formally divided the process. A bishop would be invested with his spiritual authority, his ring and staff, by the pope, affirming his role as a shepherd of the church. But he would receive the symbols of his temporal lands and powers from the emperor, acknowledging his role as a prince of the empire. This delicate balance acknowledged that the two powers were locked in an inseparable and often contentious embrace. The Holy Roman Empire endured for nearly 1,000 years, a living fossil of the Roman ideal, but its decentralized nature and the constant tension with the papacy ensured it would never become the centralized superstate of ancient memory. It was a magnificent paradox, an empire in name that proved just how difficult it was to resurrect the ghost of Rome in a world now built on local power and sacred authority. That very process of absorption created one of the most dynamic forces of the medieval world. The descendants of the Vikings who settled in Normandy did not remain simple raiders for long. They became the Normans, and their true genius lay not in destruction, but in a breathtaking ability to adopt and refine the cultures they encountered. They swiftly abandoned their Old Norse tongue for the French language of their new home, embraced the Catholic faith with fervor, and mastered the Frankish feudal system of warfare and knighthood until they became its ultimate practitioners. They learned to build not just longships, but towering stone castles that would become the new blueprint for military architecture across Europe. This cultural synthesis produced a relentless and ambitious warrior aristocracy, perfectly poised for expansion. Their most famous venture began with a dispute over a crown across the English Channel. When the Anglo-Saxon King Edward the Confessor died without a clear heir, the powerful Norman Duke William claimed he had been promised the throne. He assembled a vast invasion fleet, not of Vikings but of a highly organized feudal army, and in the year 1066 he met the Anglo-Saxon king Harold at the Battle of Hastings. The day-long clash was a brutal contest of shield walls against cavalry charges, ending with Harold's defeat. With this single victory, William the Conqueror seized the English crown. But his real work was just beginning. He systematically dismantled the old Anglo-Saxon nobility and replaced it with a new Norman-speaking elite, redistributing the land of England to his most loyal followers. To govern his new kingdom with ruthless efficiency, he commissioned the Domesday Book, a breathtakingly detailed survey of every piece of property, every plough, and every ox in the entire realm. It was an administrative marvel, a ledger of conquest that gave the crown unprecedented knowledge and control over the wealth of the nation. This was feudalism imposed with top-down precision, creating one of the most centralized and powerful monarchies in all of Europe. Yet the Norman drive did not stop at England. At the very same time, other Norman adventurers were carving out a kingdom for themselves in the sun-baked south. They traveled to southern Italy and Sicily as mercenaries, fighting for various Lombard and Byzantine lords, and ended up conquering the entire region for themselves. There, they demonstrated a different kind of genius. Instead of imposing their own culture, they created a brilliant and tolerant hybrid state. Their kingdom of Sicily became a dazzling crossroads where Norman, Latin, Greek, and Arab cultures coexisted and flourished. Muslim scholars administered the bureaucracy, Greek and Latin monks worked in the same monasteries, and Arab architects influenced the design of magnificent palaces and cathedrals. The Normans, in both of their great kingdoms, proved a profound point. They were the ultimate shape-shifters of the post-Roman world, showing that the most successful new powers were not born from purity, but from a pragmatic and powerful fusion of the old and the new. Far to the south, on a sun-scorched peninsula, another empire was quietly being rebuilt from the ground up. The Iberian Peninsula had once been a Visigothic kingdom, but in the early 8th century, an Umayyad army from North Africa crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and swiftly overran it. For a time, it seemed Muslim rule would be complete and permanent. Yet in the rugged, mountainous north, a small pocket of Christian resistance held on. According to legend, a small band of Visigothic nobles found refuge in the caves of Covadonga, and from that tiny seed, the kingdom of Asturias was born. This was the fragile beginning of a process that would span nearly 800 years, a slow, grinding campaign of expansion known as the Reconquista, the Reconquest. It was not a single, continuous war, but a long, complex rhythm of battle, truce, and settlement, pushing the frontier southward inch by hard 1 inch. From Asturias, new Christian kingdoms sprouted and grew, Leon and Castile to the west, Navarre and Aragon in the Pyrenees. Each was a frontier society, a land defined by its military border. Life here was harsh and perilous, and power naturally flowed to those who could offer protection and lead the fight. This environment forged a society of warrior barons and militant religious orders, like the Knights of Calatrava and Santiago, who were granted vast lands along the frontier in exchange for their permanent defense. A constant state of conflict demanded strong, centralized leadership. Kings in these frontier kingdoms could not afford to be distant figureheads. They had to be active commanders-in-chief, constantly rallying their forces and rewarding their most loyal knights with lands reclaimed from the south. This process forged some of the most powerful and centralized monarchies in all of medieval Europe, particularly in the rising kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. The fight to reclaim the peninsula became more than a territorial struggle. It evolved into a powerful national and religious mission, a crusading ideology that united the population under their king and their faith. This centuries-long endeavor created a new kind of reborn empire on Europe's southwestern frontier, one tempered in the fire of a permanent holy war, and whose ambition would soon carry it far beyond the shores of the continent it helped to redefine. While kings and knights fought over land, another kind of power was quietly cultivating the soil itself. Monasteries became the quiet engines of Europe's rebirth, transforming faith into a tangible force that reshaped the very earth. The most influential of these was the Benedictine order, founded by Saint Benedict in the 6th century. His simple but revolutionary idea was a rule, a guide for monastic life built on the twin pillars of prayer and work. This rule promised stability and order in a world that had little of either. Men and women flocked to these communities, seeking a life of purpose and spiritual discipline. But a monastery was far more than a secluded house of prayer. It was a self-sufficient economic powerhouse, a center of industry, and a fortress of knowledge. To support their large communities, monks and nuns had to become masters of the land. They undertook massive projects of environmental engineering, clearing ancient forests and draining pestilential swamps to create rich new farmland. They became Europe's most innovative farmers, developing and refining agricultural techniques that would gradually spread to the surrounding countryside. They built mills for grinding grain, workshops for metalworking, and breweries for producing ale and beer. Their disciplined, collective labor turned wilderness into productive estates, creating vast networks of wealth that made the larger monasteries some of the most powerful landowners in Europe. This economic influence gave abbots and abbesses a voice that kings and nobles could not ignore. They became political players, advisors to the powerful, and stabilizing forces in their regions. Yet their most lasting gift to the future was their dedication to the written word. In their scriptoriums, by the faint light of candles, monks spent countless hours copying not only sacred scriptures, but also the surviving works of classical antiquity. The poems of Virgil, the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, the scientific texts of Galen, all were preserved by this unbroken chain of scribes. They were not merely photocopiers of the ancient world, they were its librarians, ensuring that the light of classical learning was never completely extinguished. Centuries later, a new order would emerge, seeking a return to a stricter, simpler interpretation of the Benedictine rule. The Cistercians, led by the formidable Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, founded their monasteries in even more remote and inhospitable valleys. Their white-robed monks embraced manual labor with a new intensity, often specializing in large-scale sheep farming that connected them to the burgeoning textile trade across Europe. Through their practical, hands-on faith, these monastic communities demonstrated that spiritual devotion could be the very force that tamed a wilderness, organized an economy, and saved a civilization's memory from oblivion. That same spiritual energy that built monasteries and humbled emperors could also be forged into a sword. For centuries, pilgrims from Europe had traveled to Jerusalem, a journey fraught with hardship but central to their faith. By the 11th century, that path was closing. The Holy Land had fallen under the control of powerful new Turkish rulers, whose approach to these Christian travelers was far less tolerant than their predecessors. Tales of persecution and blocked routes began filtering back to the west, stirring deep unease. Then, in the year 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a great council in Clermont, France, and delivered a speech that would set history on a new course. He called upon the knights of Europe to cease their endless wars against one another and instead turn their violence outward to a sacred cause. He urged them to take up the cross and embark on an armed pilgrimage to liberate Jerusalem from its rulers. The response was electric. The cry of Deus Vult, God wills it, echoed across the continent. But what truly drove tens of thousands to leave their homes for a desperate, dangerous campaign so far away? The motivation was a powerful blend of the sacred and the secular. For the Pope, this was a chance to unite a fractured Christendom under the banner of the papacy, redirecting the destructive energies of the knightly class toward a common enemy and vastly expanding the Church's influence. For the knights themselves, the promise was profound. The Pope offered a full indulgence, a complete remission of the temporal punishment for their sins, a spiritual guarantee that many believed would open the gates of heaven. Yet there were also powerful earthly temptations. Younger sons of nobles with no land to inherit saw an opportunity for glory and territory in the fabled wealthy East. Merchants saw new trade routes. It was faith, ambition, and greed all woven into a single, compelling call to action. The First Crusade was a chaotic and brutal undertaking, but against all odds, it succeeded in its primary goal. In 1099, after a grueling siege, Crusader armies stormed Jerusalem and established a series of European-styled kingdoms along the coast of the Levant: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch. These were not temporary camps, they were permanent feudal states, complete with castles, churches, and a new class of European lords ruling over a largely local population. This was Europe's first great colonial experiment, a projection of its reborn feudal system onto a global stage. While these crusader states would be constantly besieged and ultimately fall within 2 centuries, their very existence marked a dramatic shift. Europe was no longer a continent on the defensive, absorbing blows from Vikings and Magyars. It was now confidently and violently projecting its power outward. The long-term consequences of this burst of energy would reshape Europe itself. The need to fund and supply these massive expeditions accelerated the growth of a money economy, weakening the old barter system of the manor. Kings who organized and taxed for the Crusades saw their authority and treasuries grow, further centralizing power at the expense of their feudal vassals. Perhaps most importantly, contact with the sophisticated cultures of the East, even through the lens of war, opened a new world to Europeans. They encountered spices, silks, mathematics, and medical knowledge that had been lost in the West for centuries. The Crusades failed in their stated goal of permanently holding the Holy Land, but they succeeded in pulling a recovering Europe out of its isolation and setting the stage for an even greater age of exploration and exchange. The quiet hum of monastic industry and the clash of crusader swords were building a world their creators never intended. A new economic energy was stirring, one that would prove more revolutionary than any army. Beginning around the 11th century, a profound transformation began to ripple across Europe, a shift so powerful historians call it the Commercial Revolution. Its foundations were laid in the soil itself. The three-field system, championed by those very monasteries, was finally producing consistent agricultural surpluses. For the first time in centuries, farmers were growing more food than their own families and lords required. This created a new possibility, a disposable surplus that could be sold. At the same moment, the great waves of invasion that had terrorized the continent for generations were finally receding. The Vikings had settled, the Magyars had been contained, and the seas and roads became passably safe again. This newfound security, combined with the demand for exotic goods sparked by the Crusades, unlocked the potential for long-distance trade on a scale not seen since the days of Rome. Merchant caravans began to wind their way across Alpine passes, and cargo ships braved the Mediterranean and Baltic seas, carrying wool from England, furs from Russia, and silks and spices from the East. This flow of goods needed places to gather and be exchanged, And so the old Roman towns, long shrunken and quiet, began to swell with new life. New settlements sprouted at river crossings, natural harbors, and crossroads, often under the protective walls of a lord's castle or a monastery's gate. These were the seeds of a new urban Europe. Within these growing towns, a completely new way of life emerged, one that operated outside the rigid hierarchies of the feudal and manorial systems. The people who lived here were not bound to the land like serfs, nor were they warriors like knights. They were craftsmen, shopkeepers, and merchants, a new social class who earned their living not with a plow or a sword, but with money and skill. They became known as burghers or the bourgeoisie, the town dwellers. Their wealth was liquid and mobile, stored in coins and goods, not frozen in acres of farmland. This gave them a unique and dangerous kind of independence. A skilled clothmaker or a successful spice trader could become richer than a local knight who owned a dozen villages, yet that knight held all the political power. This created a tension that would slowly unravel the medieval order. To protect their interests and regulate their new economy, these townspeople fought for and won special privileges from local lords. They secured charters that granted them the right to govern their own affairs, to hold their own courts, and to be free from the old feudal labor obligations. The heir in a chartered town, they said, made a man free. If a serf could escape his manor and live in a town for a year and a day without being caught, he was legally a free man. The town walls now enclosed a rival center of power, one built on commerce and coin, and it stood in direct opposition to the castle on the hill, whose power was built on land and loyalty. This new economic vitality did not just challenge the old nobility, it also created a powerful new partner for kings. Monarchs, always seeking ways to centralize their power and weaken their overmighty barons, saw in these wealthy towns a golden opportunity. Instead of relying on feudal levies of knights who served for only 40 days, a king could tax the burghers and use that money to pay for a professional, standing army that was loyal only to the crown. In return, he would grant the towns royal protection and further trading rights. This alliance between the rising monarchies and the rising middle class would become one of the most powerful forces in the late medieval world, quietly building the financial foundations of the modern state while the old feudal order crumbled around it. Gregory VII did not merely see a church, he saw a kingdom. His vision for the papacy was absolute and uncompromising, a spiritual monarchy that would stand above the crowns of the world. He believed the Pope held a divine authority so complete it was called the plenitudo potestatis, the fullness of power. This was not just the right to guide souls, but the ultimate authority to judge, depose, and even anoint emperors. To make this theory a reality, he launched a revolution from within, a sweeping set of reforms aimed at purifying the church and freeing it from the grubby hands of secular lords. His primary target was the entrenched practice of lay investiture, where kings and emperors would hand a newly appointed bishop the ring and staff that symbolized his office. For Gregory, this was a corrupting inversion of the natural order, a signal that the state owned the church. His declaration that only the Pope could appoint or depose bishops was a direct challenge to the very foundation of imperial power. It sparked the most dramatic confrontation of the age, pitting him against the young and proud Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. When Henry refused to back down, Gregory unleashed the spiritual weapons that made the papacy a super-governmental force. He excommunicated the emperor, cutting him off from the sacraments and, in effect, from the community of the faithful. But he went further. He declared Henry deposed, absolving all of the emperor's subjects, every duke, count, and knight, from their oaths of loyalty. This was the interdict in its most potent form, a decree that could shatter a kingdom from within. the spiritual sanction instantly became a political earthquake. Facing widespread rebellion from his own nobles who saw the Pope's decree as a license to revolt, Henry was left with no choice. In the bitter winter of 1077, the most powerful man in the secular world traveled to a castle at Canossa in the Italian Alps. There, for 3 days, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow outside the gates, a penitent beggar pleading for the Pope's forgiveness. Gregory finally relented and readmitted him to the church, but the symbolic victory was absolute. The image of an emperor humbled before a pope sent a shockwave through Christendom. It was a public, undeniable declaration that in the final reckoning, the spiritual sword was superior to the temporal one. This era of the papal monarchy represented the ultimate consequence of the Church stepping into Rome's ancient vacuum. It was no longer just one power among many. It was the ultimate arbiter, a court of final appeal for all of Europe, capable of making kings kneel with nothing but the authority of its word. While the papacy was asserting its spiritual supremacy, a quieter revolution was reshaping power from the ground up in England. The chaos of conquest under William the Normans had left a patchwork of local feudal courts, each lord administering his own, often arbitrary version of justice. This system was inherently weak, favoring local power over the crown. But a century later, a king named Henry II saw a path to unify his realm not just by force, but through the power of law itself. His vision was a system of common law, a single body of legal principles that would apply to every person in the kingdom, from the highest baron to the lowest farmer. This was a radical departure from the feudal norm where justice depended entirely on which lord's land you stood on. How did he achieve this? He launched a legal offensive using 3 brilliant and practical tools. First, he sent his own royal judges out on regular journeys or circuits across the country. These traveling judges became the eyes and ears of the king, bringing the authority of the crown to the most remote shires. Wherever they set up court, they applied a consistent set of rules based on previous royal decisions, slowly building a common legal tradition that everyone could understand and expect. Second, he revived and formalized an old Norman practice, the jury. But this was not a trial jury as we know it. Initially, it was a group of 12 local men sworn to tell the truth about what they knew of a case, a jury of presentment. They were a fact-finding body, using local knowledge to inform the judge's ruling, replacing the older, more unpredictable methods like trial by combat or ordeal. This was a monumental shift, replacing physical tests with a community-based inquiry. Third, and perhaps most cleverly, Henry made his royal courts more attractive than the local feudal ones. He created a series of standardized writs, which were essentially royal commands written on parchment. If you had a dispute over land, for example, you could purchase a writ from the royal chancery for a fee. This writ would order the local sheriff to bring the case before the king's judges. The royal courts were often seen as fairer and more efficient, and soon people actively sought them out. This steady flow of cases and fees into the royal treasury, while bypassing the local lords, dramatically centralized legal power in the hands of the monarchy. The king's law was now the best law in the land. This system of common law did more than just strengthen the crown. It created a stable framework for society. It protected property rights with a clarity that encouraged investment and commerce. It established the principle that the law was a sovereign entity, something that even the king was theoretically under. This was the rebirth of administrative order, a legal foundation so robust it would survive civil wars and revolutions, and one day cross oceans to influence nations that did not yet exist. Soaring stone began to whisper a new truth across the skies of Europe. In the 12th century, a radical new architecture emerged, one that seemed to defy the very weight of the world. This was the Gothic style, and it was far more than a new way to build. It was a declaration in stone and glass. After centuries of fortress-like Romanesque churches with their thick walls and small windows, these new cathedrals reached for the heavens with a breathtaking lightness. They were physical proof of a civilization reborn, confident enough to channel its wealth and its faith into monuments of stunning beauty. The secret to this miracle of height and light lay in a series of brilliant engineering innovations. Builders discovered that by using a pointed arch instead of a rounded Roman arch, they could direct the weight of the ceiling downward more efficiently. This allowed for taller, more slender walls. Then came the ribbed vault, a skeleton of stone ribs that carried the ceiling's load down to specific pillars. But the true stroke of genius was the flying buttress, an external stone arm that reached over the side aisles to brace the soaring central walls against the outward thrust of the vault. These stone arcs, looking like delicate wings, bore the structural burden, freeing the walls from their load-bearing duty. And what did they do with these newly liberated walls? They filled them with immense windows of stained glass, transforming the very nature of light itself. In a cathedral like Chartres or Notre Dame de Paris, sunlight did not simply illuminate the space, it became the space. It poured through brilliant blues and deep reds, painting the interior with a celestial glow, telling the stories of the Bible in vibrant color to a largely illiterate population. These were not projects for a distant emperor, but for the entire community. Bishops provided the vision, kings donated funds, guilds of merchants sponsored windows, and every townsperson had a stake in the construction, which often spanned generations. A Gothic cathedral was the ultimate symbol of civic pride, a testament to the harmonious union of faith, reason, and collective effort. It stood as a permanent rebuke to the old idea of a dark age, proving that from the fragmented world left by Rome, a new and luminous civilization had indeed been born. Just as Europe's new kingdoms were finding their footing, a storm was gathering on the eastern horizon. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire erupted out of the steppes of Central Asia, a force of nature on horseback that would deliver the last great external shock to the medieval world. Under the brilliant and ruthless leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, their armies achieved a scale of conquest that dwarfed anything seen since the days of Rome. They moved with a terrifying speed and coordination, their horse archers capable of firing with deadly accuracy from a full gallop. This was a military machine perfected for annihilating organized resistance. Their westward push first shattered the Kievan Rus Federation, a loose collection of Slavic principalities that had been a major power in Eastern Europe. City after city fell to the Mongol onslaught, leaving a landscape transformed. The Mongols did not stop there. They pushed deeper into Europe, and in 1241, a Mongol army met a combined force of Polish and German knights at the Battle of Legnica. The European heavy cavalry, the pride of Christendom, was utterly outmaneuvered and decimated by the mobile Mongol tactics. It seemed as if nothing could stop the tide. Yet, at the very moment when Western Europe lay vulnerable, the Mongols withdrew. The death of the great Khan required their commanders to return to the heart of their empire to choose a successor, a political accident that spared the fractured kingdoms of France and the German states from a direct invasion they were ill prepared to withstand. The immediate threat receded, but the Mongol impact had already reshaped the continent's foundations. Though Western Europe was spared conquest, the constant pressure on its eastern flank forced a dramatic political response. Kingdoms like Poland and Hungary, which bore the brunt of the raids, had to consolidate power rapidly to survive. Weak, fragmented principalities were no longer viable. This existential threat accelerated the rise of stronger, more centralized monarchies capable of funding standing armies and building formidable fortifications, a necessary evolution for survival in a newly dangerous world. But the Mongol legacy was not one of pure destruction. Their vast, unified empire, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, created an unprecedented era of stability across the trade routes of Asia, known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. For the first time in centuries, the Silk Road was safe and open from one end to the other. European merchants, most famously Marco Polo, could travel these protected routes deep into China and back, carrying with them new ideas, technologies, and a wealth of knowledge about the world beyond Christendom. This exchange transmitted crucial innovations to the West, including gunpowder, the compass, and advances in mathematics and medicine. The Mongol invasion, therefore, was a paradox. It was a hammer blow that destroyed old powers in the East, but it was also a bridge, forcibly connecting a once isolated Europe to the wider currents of global commerce and intellect, setting the stage for the great age of exploration that would soon follow. A ship drifting into a Sicilian port in 1347 carried more than just cargo. It carried a silent, unseen passenger that would unravel the remaining threads of the medieval world. The Black Death, a devastating illness, swept across Europe with terrifying speed, leaving unimaginable loss in its wake. Within just a few years, it is believed that perhaps a third to half of the entire population was gone. The impact was not just a matter of numbers, it was a complete shattering of the social fabric. The manorial system, the very bedrock of the feudal economy, crumbled almost overnight. With so many workers gone, the fields lay fallow. The few peasants and serfs who survived found themselves in a position of unexpected power. Labor had become a rare and valuable commodity. For the first time, they could demand to be paid actual wages for their work, and they could leave their ancestral manors in search of the best offers. The old obligations, the required days of labor on the Lord's land, the countless fees, became impossible to enforce. The foundation of the entire system, the idea that people were bound to the land, had been broken by sheer, brutal necessity. This chaos sparked a deep and profound crisis of faith. Why had their prayers gone unanswered? Why had so many clergy who tended to the sick also perished? The authority of the Church, which had promised spiritual protection, was severely weakened. People searched for answers, some turning to new forms of personal piety, while others blamed societal injustice. This simmering discontent eventually boiled over into open rebellion, like the Great Peasants' Revolt in England, where commoners demanded an end to serfdom and called for more rights. The old order was not just sick, it was being challenged in the streets. From this unprecedented hardship, however, came a forced and painful transformation. The collapse of the population, while a human tragedy of the highest order, dealt a final, decisive blow to the economic structures that Rome's fall had set in motion 1,000 years earlier. The scarcity of workers meant that wages rose, giving ordinary people more economic freedom. Landlords, desperate to attract labor, were forced to commute those old feudal labor services into cash rents. The economy, once based on the static wealth of land and service, was now lurching irrevocably toward a system based on money and wages. The Black Death was the great, terrible accelerator, forcing the final metamorphosis of the medieval world and clearing the ground for a new age to emerge from the ashes. That quiet hum of commerce and the shock of the great illness had shifted the very ground beneath the feet of kings. The feudal pyramid, once the only structure that worked, was now showing deep cracks. Ambitious monarchs saw their chance. They began a deliberate, patient campaign to rebuild a new kind of power from the top down. A power that would finally eclipse the local authority of their own barons. The key was money. A king who relied solely on the income from his own lands and the 40 days of service from his vassals was forever limited, forever negotiating. But a king who could tax his entire kingdom directly could build something unprecedented, a professional army loyal only to the crown. In England, kings began to levy taxes on movable property, a direct charge on the burgeoning wealth of merchants and landowners that bypassed the old feudal agreements entirely. In France, the Capetian dynasty, once confined to a small region around Paris, embarked on a centuries-long project of territorial expansion. Through a combination of strategic marriage, inheritance, and outright conquest, they steadily absorbed the great feudal duchies one by one, turning the patchwork of France into a unified realm under the direct control of the Parisian crown. This required a new class of administrators, not barons who owed their position to birth, but literate commoners trained in law and finance who served at the king's pleasure. These royal bureaucrats began to create a centralized government that could enforce the king's law and collect the king's taxes in every corner of the kingdom. Perhaps the most dramatic symbol of this new consolidation came in the kingdoms of Spain. For centuries, the Iberian Peninsula had been divided between Muslim states in the south and competing Christian kingdoms in the north. Then, in 1469, a marriage of profound consequence united two of the most powerful crowns. Ferdinand of Aragon married Isabella of Castile. This union did not create a single country overnight, but it fused their military might and political will into a single force. Together, they completed the Reconquista, capturing the last Muslim stronghold of Granada in 1492. They enforced religious unity, expelled Jewish and Muslim populations, and funded voyages of exploration that would open new worlds. Their reign created a powerful, centralized Spanish monarchy, a true nation-state with a global horizon. This was the ultimate political rebirth from Rome's ashes. The fragmented, localized world of feudalism, born from the collapse of imperial authority 1,000 years earlier, was finally giving way. The age of the castle and the personal oath was ending, and the age of the capital city, the national treasury, and the royal army was dawning. The long medieval experiment in decentralized power had run its course, and the modern state, with the sovereign monarch at its head, was being